Ink Ribbon.
After knocking Nintendo off their throne in the console market, Sony decided to throw their hat into the handheld console market, which up to that point Nintendo really didn't have any competition, and it created one of the coolest systems that ever existed. I'm so excited for this video, so I'll get straight to the good stuff. From Hannah Montana to Hilton Hotels, here are 50 facts about the PlayStation Portable. After being announced at E3 2003, Sony finally released the PSP on December 12, 2004 in Japan, and later released in North America on March 24, 2005, and in Europe on September 1, 2005. The PSP was the first handheld console to successfully rival Nintendo, where Sega, Bandai, SNK, and Nokia had all failed, though the DS did ultimately beat the PSP in sales. On release, the PSP retailed for $250. The PSP used a proprietary format called UMD, which was a tiny optical disc in a plastic casing that was used for both games and videos. The UMD video market was actually very successful, with over 600 UMD movies, music videos, and TV shows released. Almost 2,000 if you count Japanese and adult media. There are several huge PSP titles that were never released digitally and are only available on physical UMDs, including Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep, Burnout Legends, and many more. Almost half the PSP library, actually. One of the biggest criticisms of the PSP was its analog stick, though it was more of a nub. Its placement being so close to the D-pad as well as the lack of a second analog stick severely hindered the camera controls for almost every 3D game on the system. A lot of well-known series had PSP games released only in Japan, such as Yakuza, Echo Knight, Digimon, and more. And you'll be happy to know that fan translations for all of those have been released. The PSP launch was delayed in PAL regions due to the high demand and ended up having the most success of any other region, with all PSPs selling out within 3 hours of launch. The PSP was not region coded, so you could play PSP games from any country on it. However, the UMD movies were still region locked. The PSP had different models over its lifespan. First was the PSP 1000, the original unit, then a revised version, the PSP 2000, which was a slimmer model that also doubled the RAM from 32 to 64 and added video output, followed by the PSP 3000, which had an upgraded screen and is widely considered the best version. Later, there was a redesigned PSP dubbed the PSP Go that was made more as a novelty, with it now sliding to open and close and having no disk drive. Alongside the announcement of the PS Vita, Sony also announced a new PSP for PAL regions only called the PSP Street, also known as the PSP E1000. It's a stripped-down version of the console that has removed Wi-Fi, has a mono speaker, and is lighter. It was very short-lived, being discontinued the same year it was released. I'd love to list all the variants of the PSP, but there are so many colors, styles, special editions, country-specific models, and more that I gave up trying to list them all. So I'll just say that the main colors that were released were black, silver, white, blue, red, yellow, and green. To ensure the PSP had a chance for success, Sony preemptively got about 99 known game companies to pledge their support for the handheld, including Konami, Rockstar, Capcom, Square Enix, and more.
On PlayStation Portable. This includes 34 companies from Japan, like Konami, Capcom, Namco, and Bandai. 24 companies from North America, like Electronic Arts, Activision, THQ, and Take-Two.
Even though it was never utilized, the PSP 1000 had an IR sensor. It was later used by modders to make the handheld double as a universal remote though. In addition to being the main competitor to the Nintendo DS, the PSP inadvertently also became the only real rival to Apple, who had recently released the iPod Video. If you've played a PSP game, then you probably know what its startup sound is. But did you know that there were not only one, but two different startup sounds? Here's the original. And here is the second version. Early on, Sony released a few PSP demo discs, dubbed samplers. They also released Spider-Man 2 as a promotional UMD, most likely to introduce consumers to the idea of watching movies on the PSP. The original PSP concept depicted a PSP as a glossy, smooth system with no raised buttons and was smaller, more resembling the PSP Go. The PSP was popular among more than just gamers, since it offered so many different multimedia features that, at the time, were amazing. It played music, displayed photos, it let you watch videos and movies, and it even had its own internet browser. The marketing for the PSP had a few controversies as a result of some questionable choices. One was when they had advertisers posing as young bloggers online who would constantly post about how desperately they wanted a PSP. Another was paying building owners and graffiti artists in major cities like New York, Atlanta, and San Francisco to spray paint PSP slogans around. Later in the UK this was repeated, but some of them were removed, like one that was near a train platform that said, "Take a running jump here," which sparked fear that it might encourage someone to actually jump in front of a train. The most controversial ad was one in the Netherlands that was meant to promote the new white variant of the PSP, depicting two women who were literally black and white, with the white woman grabbing her by the face alongside the slogan, "PlayStation Portable White is coming." It was also speculated that this was intentionally done to generate free publicity, but take that with a grain of salt. There was a section of the PSP digital store for smaller games, dubbed minis. Some of these went on to be huge games, and it's a treasure trove of some of the best indie games made at the time. The PSP had a camera peripheral add-on that attached on the top, and I have one. This is what the quality of the PSP camera looks and sounds like. Please like and subscribe. Sony released a special cable for the PSP 2000 and 3000 models that allowed output to TVs. Speaking of TV, there was also a Japanese peripheral that turned the PSP into a working TV, able to pick up channels, and according to videos I found, it actually still works today. It was really hard to find information about it, which tells me it was really only in Japan and possibly Europe, but there was a GPS peripheral for the PSP that, when used with its software, would turn your PSP into a functioning GPS navigation tool and apparently also still works. The rarest PSP system was the Warhammer 40,000 Squad Commander console. There were only 6 released and were only given away as prizes to celebrate the launch of the game, and none have ever shown up for sale. Over the years, the modding community slowly began cracking the PSP open, and once it was discontinued, turned the PSP into a powerhouse of emulation, enabling it to play not only PSP games, but PS1 games, Nintendo 64 games, and almost every retro console you can imagine. There was a game series called Talkman, which used microphone peripheral mounted onto the PSP to both help learn a language and translate languages, originally operating with Japanese, English, Korean, and Mandarin, before later expanding into more languages.
I wonder if you can handle this one.
Sayonara.
Oh, that's gonna be easy.
Sayonara.
If I had to say one way or the other, that was excellent.
Oh, excellent!
Along with its other multimedia features, the PSP also functions as an e-reader for books and comics. While playing most games, you are able to reset by holding L, R, and Start. Some games boot you to the main menu, while others will exit the game completely. The default menu will change colors every month, with each month having its own color. The PSP launched with 24 games in its library, including some big titles like Metal Gear Acid and Lumines. There were a lot of cancelled games for the handheld from franchises like Duke Nukem, Far Cry, Saints Row, Tomb Raider, and even Elder Scrolls. Possibly the rarest PSP game is one that you actually can't buy. It's called the Hilton family and was used by Hilton Hotels to train new staff. Copies usually go for over $3,000. One of the infamous licensed versions of the PSP was the Hannah Montana edition. It actually came in 3 variants, with purple for North America, pink for Europe, and the very limited turquoise version only in Russia. The turquoise was reused for other releases though. After the PS3 launched, there were plans to add trophy support for the PSP, but the idea was cancelled after Sony learned how far firmware cracking had evolved by that point. There were supposed to be 2 Resident Evil games released for the PSP. One was a port of Resident Evil Outbreak, which was later scrapped with Capcom deciding to focus on Monster Hunter instead. The other is the elusive Resident Evil Portable, which aside from a title announcement was never elaborated on. It's highly speculated that it eventually became Resident Evil Revelations, but there's no concrete answer. The PSP featured the ability to connect to PS3s and serve as both a controller and a display. I used it back in the day and it worked surprisingly well. The PSP features 2 ways to play multiplayer, traditionally online or via ad hoc mode, which is a local connection. Several multiplayer games had a really cool feature where if your friend didn't have a copy of the same game, your PSP could allow theirs to download a demo copy of the game so that you can play together, even if it's just for that session. The all-time top-selling PSP game ever was Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories, selling over 8 million copies. This is what a PSP development kit looks like. You can find them on sale around the internet for about $1,000. There are a lot of homebrew games and applications unofficially released for the system, which some of the most popular ones being fan recreations of popular games such as Turok, Minecraft, Streets of Rage, Halo, and more. While the PSP performed extremely well, it wasn't able to outsell Nintendo, selling 80 million units less than the DS. In June 2014, 10 years after its release, the PSP was officially discontinued as work began on its successor, the PS Vita. And that's it for this list. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I remember working at my fast food job at Whataburger and saving my paycheck so that I could buy a PSP, and I literally ended up paying for the last part of it with a big jar of change. The PSP was an amazing handheld, and part of the reason I'm such a big fan of the Vita. I'd love to hear what the PSP meant to those of you who played it back in the day, so leave your stories in the comments, and if you learned something new, then please press that X button to like this video. Be sure to check out my other facts videos. I did one on the Dreamcast and the PS1, and if there's another game system you'd like me to cover, let me know in the comments. Until next time, I'm Kai Morgan, and as always, thanks for watching Ink Ribbon. And a very special thank you to all of my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. Your extra support means the world to me and helps me keep making content for you guys.